So far as the text that we are supposed to begin today is concerned, as you may know, this text is a part of your colonial, post-colonial paper, and it is titled The Discovery of Guyana. It was written by Sir Walter Raleigh sometime in 1596, though, specifying a single year to this work would be erroneous because this text was being built experience by experience for quite some time before 1596. Now, the reason why we are to study this text as a part of our postgraduate course, or why this text is at all academically important today, is because this text is one of the first authentic texts which deals with the concept of the beginnings of colonialism. Now, when we say that this text is a text that begins with the initial days of colonialism, we are not saying that British colonialism or European colonialism for that matter that began in 1596. In fact, history of colonialism suggests that colonial pursuits in whatever form that began almost 100 years earlier to Walter Raleigh's book, The Discovery of Guyana. And one of the primary reasons why colonialism was already about 100 years old was because of two countries, Spain and Portugal. If we look at the history of colonialism, we will encounter a very, very important treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas. I'll spell it for you, Treaty of Tordesillas, Tordesillas. This treaty was inked in 1494 between Spain and Portugal, and these two countries, interestingly, wrote to divide the new world, that is the world that was being discovered, between Spain and Portugal with the approval of the Pope. Why with the approval of the Pope? Because Pope was, obviously, as we all know, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and Spain and Portugal at that point in time were both Roman Catholic nations. Okay, so as early as 1494, people in Spain and Portugal began realizing that in the new world that is to be discovered outside Europe, there were only two countries whose navy or whose ships could sail for long distances and discover new worlds, whether it's sailing westwards and crossing the Atlantic, or it is whether crossing the Atlantic diagonally to reach South America from Europe, or even in India's case, the East Indies, going south from Europe all the way to Cape of Good Hope in Africa, the southernmost tip of Africa, and then turning eastwards and landing in India, or for that matter, the East Indies. So by 1494, both Spain and Portugal had attained a state of serious shipbuilding. And remember, these were not ships which were merely built to carry a few sailors in order to discover new lands. They were all ships which were made to withstand the rough waves of the Atlantic and the other seas, and as well as to carry precious goods. It may be silk, it may be muslin, it may be spices from the newly discovered lands in back into Europe. Okay, so the first important thing about European colonialism is the art, the successful art of constructing ships. We can all understand that well, crossing the Atlantic either diagonally or even in a straight westward motion towards the Americas, North America in today's terms, that was never easy and could not have been possible without the sturdiest of ships and the most soundest of shipbuilding engineering. Okay, so the mastery of shipbuilding was the primary step which propelled European imperialism or colonialism. In other words, the entire issue of which nations could be successful colonizers depended almost entirely on which nation could master the art of sound shipbuilding. And quite clearly, history of colonialism in Europe suggests that Spain and Portugal were far ahead of the other countries. When did Vasco da Gama, for example, land in India? Well, roughly around the same time. And clearly, Vasco da Gama's attempt was not, it may be the first successful attempt, but it was not the first attempt. We don't know how many ships capsized and how many, say, hundreds of sailors were drowned before. So these tasks were essentially hazardous tasks, and people who embarked on them almost always understood that the voyage they are undertaking may be the last voyage. Other than natural hazards, hazards of storms, etc., there were also other biological hazards of undergoing these long sea journeys, and one of which was clearly nutritional. We all know how the history of scurvy literature says that sailors who sailed for months at an end often suffered very critical deficiencies of certain vitamins, which gave rise to very odd and serious health hazards. Okay, so the hazard was not only natural; the hazard was also related to availability of food, fresh water, and sustenance while they were undergoing sea voyages. Now, the next question that we are to handle in all of this is, if we are to encounter so much of hazards and clearly we may not return, why is it that we need to undergo voyages of such enormous lengths to discover new lands? Remember, discovery of new lands were actually attempts at discovery. I mean, you set out, you may discover, you may not. And you may reach such a stage in the seas that even turning back would be as hazardous as going forward the same distance. So clearly, the primary reason why these countries had this idea that they were essentially born to discover new lands is because of a very, very typical Renaissance strain which focused on human capabilities as the ultimate capability of existence. In other words, the entire concept of attempting to discover new lands was built on the premise that human beings had enormous untapped potential, and one of the primary potentials of man is to improve upon the knowledge that he has already got from other sources. Now, in order to improve upon the knowledge that I get from other sources, one of the important ways that I can do it, and do it very, very startlingly, is to venture out to discover new lands. Now, with the attempt at discovering new lands, we will also be dealing with the attempt as an explorer or a discoverer, we will also be dealing with convincing my people back home that I have indeed visited certain places. In Shakespeare, for example, or in many other Elizabethan texts, we have references where people brought in weird looking creatures which they felt were weird and exhibited them in the marketplace in order for the viewers to give some money so that some earnings can be made out of those people. So clearly, when we have a case where people were wanting to give proof, usually of creatures or even of certain beings or even of certain entities which were not available or visible in England, that would have been considered as sufficient proof that a person has visited a new land or discovered a new land. And therefore, rather than any theoretical account of a discovery, if the theoretical account is backed up with the production of an entity which is new to the place or which is totally unknown to England, my credibility as a discoverer would increase. So, in other words, the first challenge was to actually discover new lands. The second was to live long enough to return back with a proof of discovery. In Walter Raleigh's case, the issue of discovery of new lands went into one higher stage of theoretical refinement. Now, what do I mean by theoretical refinement? Remember, as I told you, the initial days of European colonialism, well, it began sometime in the 1470s, 80s. Or by the 1490s, Spain and Portugal were competing one against the other in order to discover new lands. 100 years later, when people like Walter Raleigh, they embark on voyages, their purpose is not merely discovery. Their purpose is to colonize in the most philosophical sense of the term. Now, what do we usually mean by colonization? Now, colonization, judged in itself, is a very, very complex and loaded theoretical term. For many, like us, who have been at the receiving end of colonialism, colonialism was essentially a practice which is, however philosophically couched, a practice in an unjust transfer of wealth by the misuse of a political or a philosophical or an administrative power. The Britishers' relations to us with us, for example, is one. But from their viewpoint, from the viewpoint of the colonizers, they were wanting to couch their apparent economics behind this attempted colonization with philosophies. What was the philosophy that is usually peddled out by the colonizers? The obvious philosophy is a refinement in civilization. In other words, a colonizer colonizes because he or she feels or it feels as a nation that a particular region has to be civilized. This is the justification of the colonizers from the side of the colonizers, that I am visiting a land, I will be occupying that land, and while occupying that land, I will be civilizing them. Now, the word civilizing them is again a very loaded term, which essentially means taking the main people who are colonized, who are occupied, and creating conditions whereby their lifestyles, their ways of thought, their living will, in due course of time, imitate the thought process of the colonizers. In other words, the context and the conditions that are created by the colonizers are such that the colonized would automatically understand or would believe that unless I am able to do this, whatever that can be, I won't be close enough to the mainstream or to the centers of power. The use of English, for example, in the British relationship with India's colonizers, the use of English, the whole context changed in the course of 150 years to such an extent that any reasonably educated man in British India was expected to be conversant in the verbal use as well as the written use of English. Why? Simply because the context and the conditions created, they were meant to establish one mainstream, and that one mainstream is a mainstream that is dictated by the colonizing powers. Anything which is outside the periphery of that mainstream would be disadvantaged to such an extent that in due course of time, even that person would be feeling that it is much more convenient to be within the mainstream than outside. So these are the contexts and the conditions which are deliberately created by the colonizing powers in order to force allegiance. And when you force allegiance, clearly you don't force permanence or permanent. It's not a case of a permanent faith in a system. It only deals with what? It only deals with the fact that so long as my core interests are catered to, I will accept you as my colonizer. But if somewhere down the line a ribbon is broken or a margin is floundered, I will try and evict you from the status of colonizers. So the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized have been very, very intriguing in the course of colonial history. And with regard to these countries, which were then considered new lands or new worlds, as it were, and worlds predominantly meant the North Americas as we know it today. It predominantly meant the South Americas as we know it today. It predominantly meant the East Indies. And India was an accidental outcome of their East Indies venture, and parts of Africa. These were the new lands for the colonizers. So when Walter Raleigh, or for that matter an Elizabethan colonizer, would embark on a colonizing mission, he was actually embarking on a trade mission. This is something very, very important. Philosophy came much later, when they had to justify the practice of occupying other lands. The initial motivating force was trade and profit. And judged in that extent, what usually happens in most cases is that people who are colonizing, they target lands which are known to give out certain commodities which would give them financial returns when they are taken back home in England, or for that matter in any European country. Spices, for example, were a rarity even in as late as Elizabethan England, and spices were meant to be used only in the tables of or in the kitchens of the royals. So automatically, when people realized or traders realized that we can capture certain lands which are home to spices in plenty, They target those lands in order to bring in spices and sell them at a premium in Europe so that even the commoners can access this. Muslins or fabrics which were totally foreign to Europe. This is another trading commodity which was targeted by the European colonizers. And you'll be surprised to know if you study Elizabethan clothing, for example, how expensive and difficult it was to weave a piece of cloth, even for the commoners, let alone for the royals. Gold threads coming from one country. If you minutely look at, for example, the gown which Queen Elizabeth wears in most of her portraits, those were gowns which, on a modest estimate, took months to weave. But at the same time, it had to be that so that by dress, a person can differentiate himself from the lower ranks of the society. Muslins were therefore a commodity which again was traded at a premium. Then obviously there was gold, which is of immediate interest in our text of Walter Raleigh, the discovery of Guiana. In fact, the word Guinea, as we know as gold, is linked to the name of the land which Walter Raleigh supposedly discovered. But obviously he never discovered. It was already a Spanish colony by the time Walter Raleigh went there. We'll go to the text in later class. So basically, when we are reading this text, we are to justify ourselves of the fact that this is a text which gives us a very, very lengthy and an authentic, some dispute it as inauthentic, but nevertheless we will take it as authentic treatment of a colonial venture. Okay, so this text has to be studied in the context of colonialism as it was practiced in Elizabethan England. And remember, while we read this text, we will not only have elements of colonialism, we will have elements of Walter Raleigh's relationships with the Queen and the power centers in Elizabethan England, what happens in the course of the journey, England's relationships with Spain, because Spain was already governing the place where the place called Guiana, where Walter Raleigh is sailing, etc. So this text is important for a number of reasons. The primary reasons are threefold. First, it is a window to Elizabethan colonizing practice. Second, at a personal level, it is a reflection on Walter Raleigh as a man, an explorer, even a philosopher. And the third is the text gives us a window into the political equations of Elizabethan England, especially the political equations that existed in the later part of Elizabeth's rule. These 3 points are the points which are to be kept in mind while we read the text. Now, so far as the text is concerned, texts of the discovery of Guyana that is freely available in the net, but I found that if you visit archive.org, the website is archive.org, you may have known the website by now. That website hosts millions of books. You go to the website, you search the discovery of Guyana, Walter Raleigh, you'll be getting a number of scanned PDF files of texts from various libraries across the world. You go and download any one of them and give a reading once. There will be references which are very, very topical, which we may not immediately understand on our first reading. But nevertheless, if we read it at least once without going into the specifics, we will get to know a broader picture of this entire colonizing exercise that was undertaken by Sir Walter Raleigh. Okay. Now, Walter Raleigh, as I told you, he is one among the many explorers in England. Who are the others? I'm telling the names. They're all very special names. You will note it down. One of the first explorers of England who caught public interest goes by the name of Martin Frobisher, Martin Frobisher. This man led three expeditions in the course of 3 years between 1576 to 1578 in search of the Northwest Passage that he was convinced existed around the north of the American continent, and then west and south to the reaches of Asia. But obviously, all his attempts ended in failures because the only evidence that he apparently could bring in were pieces of rocks which he claimed were gold ores or gold bearing ore, but ultimately they were not. The other explorer that we already know through our reading of geography was Francis Drake, who between the years 1572 to 73 troubled Spanish ships, treasure ships, which were carrying precious ores and metals from as far as Peru, Venezuela, etc. And by 1580, he embarked on a voyage straight towards the Indian Ocean around the Cape of Good Hope and visited the East Indies. I mean, the days of modern Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. So again, but this time he was successful, and by 1581 he went back to Europe carrying a rich haul of spices, muslin, and gold. The third explorer goes by the name of Humphrey Gilbert, who discovered the island of Newfoundland as we know it today, and claimed that that island was a colony, an automatic colony as it were, of England. But obviously it was a very bleak land with an inclement, harsh climate, and nevertheless England's interests in this new land, which he termed as Newfoundland, were short-lived. So clearly, with regard to discoveries, these were the main explorers whose names are known today, other than, of course, Walter Raleigh, whom we will study at some greater depth. Going to the trade which these explorers indulged in, the trades were not only material, as I told you. It dealt not only with silk or muslin or gold or spices, it also dealt with human resource. In other words, the new colonies or lands that were discovered were immediately and usually militarily subjugated, and people from those newly discovered lands were brought in mostly by force into England as slaves. So slavery or slave trade was one of the unfortunate outcomes of this colonizing practice or this tendency to discover new lands. people who were brought in from various lands, usually they did not survive the harsh English climate. Quite obviously, there were no medicines or treatment as such, and being slaves, they never had any right as human beings. So the entire concept of colonization was a concept that was built on profit, both in terms of money or in terms of trading, as well as in terms of human resources. And slave trade, as we all know, it originated in the early days of colonization merely because England or most parts of Europe suffered from an acute shortage of agricultural laborers right from the 14th century. And since people who were brought in by force into Europe, or for that matter into most countries which were colonizing others, they were people who were brought in to serve as hands. Serve as hands for what? Serve as hands for usually agriculture, but at the same time, interestingly, these were the people who were also trained to handle ships and taken in these hazardous voyages. For example, in the account of the discovery of Guiana, Walter Raleigh's account, we will have people in the ships who were engaged as slaves or brought in as slaves from other lands earlier to England, and they were taken in these voyages. So clearly, we get the first signs of a cultural intermingling with these people. And on a modest estimate, I have a data which an information which says that by 1590, the number of slaves which were brought into England went to the tune of almost 5,500 per year from 1570. Okay, so every year, approximately on an average, 5,500 slaves were brought in into England from various newly discovered lands. So the entire concept of colonization, as I tell you, is a dehumanizing experience. Therefore, when we read it as an account by Walter Raleigh, the first suspicion that comes to us as readers is whether Walter Raleigh's account is an authentic account or is it a sanitized account which deliberately filters out a lot of the negative or the pejorative nuances of the practice of discovery of new lands and stresses only on the positive or only on the philosophical. Any reading of Walter Raleigh's The Discovery of Guyana would suggest that Walter Raleigh's approach to colonialism, as is apparent in this account, is a sharp departure from the actual practice of colonization that was practiced in Walter Raleigh's time, which means that Walter Raleigh's account perhaps cannot be taken at face value. We have examples in this particular text where, as an invading force, Walter Raleigh focuses only on the losses that he suffered or his team suffered while he was embarking on the conquest for gold in Guyana. It's a historical fact that he lost one of his sons in the voyage. Spaniards killed him. But the text does not tell us how many locals were persecuted or killed by the colonizers. So clearly, if we approach this text as a journalistic account of Walter Raleigh's voyage, or for that matter, as a voyage, a colonizing experience of any Elizabethan explorer, we cannot take the text at face value. These are all sanitized accounts. They were revised and re-revised in a space of a few years, and quite clearly, anything that showed the colonizing country in a poor light was ejected out of the text. Therefore, if we take this text as a text of a journalistic value, maybe we'll be disappointed, because the journalistic accuracy is very pure, very poor. Other than very neutral facts, which Walter Raleigh might have failed, would not offend anyone. The food they eat, the places where they go, the river they negotiate, the time that is taken to negotiate the rivers, these are culture neutral information which would offend no one. Those information could be correct, but information which are culturally loaded or biased are the information which are filtered out if they show the colonizers in an unfavorable light. The other thing with this text is the text carries a number of allusions to local places, local customs, etc. As readers, we would ideally be expected to understand everything that goes into the text in terms of allusions. If while reading through this text you encounter an allusion, they are all allusions which are easily traceable in the medium of the internet. You'll be getting idea and detailed explorations. Obviously, that will make your reading slow, but nevertheless, I mean, in order to understand the text at some depth, it is better to visualize the text. Otherwise, the text would seem boring. These are the places that he went. These are the places that he wished to go. These are the places that his troops encountered the Spaniards. There was a pitched battle of some sorts. It was a controlled battle, but nevertheless, there were casualties on both sides, etc. The final issue with regard to introducing the discovery of Guyana to you is Walter Raleigh's personal reputation as a courtier, as a statesman, in relation to the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth I. Walter Raleigh's biography tells us, and these biographies are readily available in the net, biography tells us that Walter Raleigh was very close to Queen Elizabeth I. He was knighted quite soon after getting introduced to her and serving as a courtier in various offices. But he was punished after he happened to get close to and marry one of the chambermaids of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, why Queen Elizabeth I took offense at one of her courtiers marrying her chambermaid is a matter of conjecture. I mean, various historians and commentators have brought in an angle of jealousy which the queen suffered from when she realized that this man, who was 24/7 devoted to her, would now perhaps have to divide his devotion between the monarch and the monarch's chambermaid. That was too much of an affront, a royal affront, as it were. That may be one of the reasons why he soon fell out of favor. But the reason which took Walter Raleigh's life was a reason that gained momentum after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. And in fact, his biography tells us he was beheaded after being charged of treachery. Now that is a story in itself. That is a separate story in itself. His speech at the scaffold, for example, is again a text that is read and reread as a text which contains philosophy, wisdom of statecraft, status of man in God's scheme of things, the relations between the subject and the royal, etc. But on an ultimate analysis, Walter Raleigh was perhaps the best person possible in terms of as an explorer, whose text would give to us the entire spectrum of colonization, discovery of new lands, and statecraft in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. The other explorers that I spoke of, the other explorers that I mentioned, they may be better discoverers of new lands. In fact, they indeed discovered new lands and became legends. But their exposure to the statecraft or to the queen or to the royal sphere of influence was so limited that their accounts would be purely journalistic accounts of voyages. Their accounts would not be loaded texts in terms of culture, which can be studied 400 or 500 years later. So, judged in that context, Walter Raleigh's position as an explorer of new lands, as an ambassador of Queen Elizabeth I, as a courtier, as a person who managed most of Queen Elizabeth I's affairs, administrative affairs, when he was one of her favorites, they all put together a complete package of an Elizabethan worldview to us. And this is the primary reason why this text is studied as almost a compulsory text in cases where culture studies related to colonization in its initial days are studied with some focus.